Jay Leno, the man who had once made the world laugh from behind the bright lights of The Tonight Show, stood alone in his Los Angeles garage that November afternoon of 2022. Surrounded by the smell of oil and the quiet hum of engines, he was in his element, repairing one of his beloved vintage cars, but in a single instant, that familiar comfort turned into a nightmare. Without warning, flames erupted from the fuel tank, a sudden explosion of fire that leapt toward him, covering his face, chest, and hands. Jay was engulfed. The comedian, who had spent decades bringing joy to millions, was now fighting for his life in silence, beneath the roar of flames. He was rushed to the Grossman Burn Center, his body wrapped in bandages, skin grafts performed to save what was left. Yet just 9 days later, Jay appeared again, his face still swollen, his hands still trembling, but his voice calm. In an interview, he simply said, "I got a face full of gasoline and it caught fire while I was working in the garage. I'm fine. Give me a week or two and I'll be back on my feet." That's who Jay Leno was. The humor never left him, even when pain tried to take everything else away. Behind the bandages was a man whose courage ran deeper than the scars forming on his skin, and standing by him, as she always had for over 40 years, was his wife, Mavis Leno. She stayed at his bedside, watching over him through sleepless nights. While the world focused on his recovery, few noticed the quiet exhaustion in her eyes. Jay never mentioned her struggle. When asked how they were doing, he smiled and said simply, "We're fine." But fate wasn't finished testing them. Just weeks after he recovered from the burns, in January 2023, tragedy struck again. While test riding his 1940 Indian motorcycle in Las Vegas, Jay crashed hard onto the asphalt. He broke his collarbone, fractured 2 ribs, and cracked both kneecaps. And yet, when reporters rushed to his door, Jay only laughed. "I broke my collarbone, a few ribs, and both kneecaps. Other than that, I'm fine." Bruised, scarred, but unbroken, Jay returned to the stage wearing his signature denim and a smile. For audiences, that moment said everything. The man who had built his life on laughter refused to surrender to pain. But behind the laughter, something deeper was beginning to change. By mid-2023, Jay Leno's body had healed, but his life was about to face a wound that no surgery could fix. The signs came quietly, small, almost unnoticeable moments. Mavis, his wife of more than 40 years, began forgetting things. At first, it was simple: missed appointments, misplaced keys, a word lost in mid-sentence. But soon, Jay noticed her struggling to remember familiar places, names, and faces that had shaped their lives together. For a man who had conquered network wars and public scrutiny with humor, this was something he couldn't joke about. The laughter faded. The silence between them grew longer. In November 2023, doctors confirmed what Jay had silently feared. Mavis Leno had entered the advanced stages of dementia. The diagnosis struck him harder than any flame or fall ever could. She began to drift in and out of recognition, sometimes calling him by name, other times staring blankly, her eyes searching for a memory that had slipped away. Jay sat quietly in that doctor's office, listening to words that rewrote the rest of his life. No camera, no audience, just the quiet ache of a man realizing that love alone could no longer protect the woman who had protected him for decades. After long discussions with doctors, friends, and family, Jay made one of the most difficult decisions of his life. In early 2024, he filed a petition for conservatorship, a legal step that would allow him to make financial and medical decisions on Mavis's behalf. The filing was nearly 100 pages long, including a report by neurologist Dr. Hart Cohen, confirming that Mavis had gradually lost cognitive function over the past several years. For 3 months, specialists examined Mavis, evaluating her condition. Their conclusion was both merciful and devastating. She was still aware enough to give consent, but no longer capable of managing their fortune or daily affairs. Jay Leno's plan was clear and heartbreakingly simple. He would create a living trust, ensuring that every dollar from his royalties, his shows, and his future work would go directly to her care. If he passed first, everything would remain hers, not divided, not sold, not touched. To him, this wasn't business, it was love, written into law. On April 9, 2024, under the heavy eyes of reporters and flashing cameras, Jay Leno walked into the Los Angeles County Superior Court. He wore a dark suit, his face calm, his posture steady, but his eyes, those eyes that once twinkled under the studio lights, carried the weight of a lifetime. When Judge Brenda Penny read the ruling, confirming him as Mavis Leno's legal conservator, Jay said only one thing: taking care of the one you love. That's what marriage means. The room fell silent. It wasn't a statement for the press. It was a vow renewed in front of the world. That day, as they left the courthouse hand in hand, Mavis smiled faintly. When a reporter asked how she felt, she said softly, "I feel fine." It was a simple answer, but for Jay, it meant everything. After the conservatorship was approved, Jay Leno's life began to move at a slower rhythm. Deliberate, quiet, and tender. The man who once lived by the ticking of television ratings now measured his days by the sound of his wife's footsteps in the hallway. He began turning down big projects, limiting his schedule to only a few charity appearances or short segments of Jay Leno's Garage Live. Each event was carefully planned so that Mavis would never have to wait long. When asked about his new pace, he simply smiled and said, "Now I only do things that don't make her wait." That one sentence spoke volumes. The transformation of a man who once raced through deadlines, now choosing patience over performance. Reporters who met him noticed something different. The once quick-talking comedian now spoke slower, more gently. When questions turned to Mavis, his tone softened. "She still has that fire," he said. "I'm just lucky to be her backup system." Those who knew them best said Jay never once let her see him sad. Even as her memory faded, he'd greet her each morning with a joke, a smile, and her favorite cup of coffee. The same routine they'd shared for decades, and every morning, Mavis would insist on making coffee for him herself. She didn't always remember the day, but she remembered that gesture. Jay never drank it. He left the cup untouched on the table, a quiet token of gratitude. Proof that part of her still remembered them. The media began calling him the last of the old school gentlemen. Disciplined, loyal, free from scandal, still driving his old cars instead of chasing fame. And Mavis, even as her health declined, remained a name respected beyond Hollywood. She had once led the Stop Gender Apartheid in Afghanistan campaign, tirelessly advocating for women's rights long before it became a global cause. Her legacy lived on even as she herself began to fade from public memory. In early 2025, a journalist asked Jay whether he saw their situation as tragic. His reply silenced the room. "I don't see this as a tragedy. It's just part of the promise I made 40 years ago." Those words revealed everything. that what others saw as suffering, Jay saw as devotion. They no longer appeared often in public, but when they did, the photos told the whole story. Her hand is still clasped in his eyes still searching for hers, and sometimes, just for a moment, Mavis would look at him a little longer, as if some hidden corner of her memory still recognized the man she'd loved since 1976. Before the fame, before the laughter, before the millions of viewers, there was just a young comedian and a woman sitting in the front row of a small Los Angeles club. It was 1976 at the Comedy Store, a place where aspiring comics fought for 5 minutes of the stage time. That night, Jay Leno was still unknown, performing with nervous energy and relentless wit. Among the crowd, one face caught his attention, Mavis Nicholson. She wasn't there to be impressed, she was there to listen. And the way Jay spoke, honest, self-deprecating, sharp, made her laugh in a way that felt genuine. Years later, Jay would recall, "I was never good at dating, but with her, I just wanted to be there." He was far from the man America would later know. He drove across estates just to perform at tiny clubs, slept in his car to save money, and lived off diner meals and hope. Mavis saw all of it, the long drives, the exhaustion, the dream that seemed impossible, and never once asked him to stop. Instead, she became his quiet anchor. She helped him polish his jokes, gave him honest feedback, and reminded him that success meant nothing without integrity. When they talked about the future, there was no mention of fame, no fantasies of Hollywood. Only one shared belief: simplicity lasts longer than glory. 4 years later, on November 30th, 1980, they married in their modest Beverly Hills home. There was no white gown, no orchestra, no red carpet, just two people making a promise. The only wedding photo they kept was of them standing beside the old car Jay had been fixing that morning. To outsiders, it looked unremarkable, but to them, it was everything. A symbol that love doesn't need to be loud to be real. From that day on, Mavis became his compass. She handled his scripts, sat in the back rows during his gigs, and kept him grounded when the world began to lift him higher. Jay once said, "I don't need much just to come home and see her there." A simple sentence that carried the weight of a lifelong truth. Their marriage had no children, a decision that raised eyebrows in an industry obsessed with image. But Mavis explained it best. We wanted to give our energy to things that reach beyond us, to our work, to others, to causes that matter. True to her word, she devoted herself to women's rights activism, while Jay supported her every step of the way. Their love was built on respect, two worlds moving at different speeds but always in sync. In a Hollywood filled with red carpets and broken vows, Jay and Mavis were an exception. They chose quiet dinners over premieres, conversation over publicity, and commitment over the spectacle. Their bond became the foundation that would carry them through every storm ahead, from the rise to fame, to the weight of legacy, and eventually to the gentle twilight of devotion. In the early 1990s, Jay Leno stood on the edge of a dream that most comedians would never reach. After years of grinding through clubs and guest appearances, he was chosen to succeed Johnny Carson, the man who had defined American late-night television for 3 decades. But from the very beginning, his appointment as host of The Tonight Show in 1992 came wrapped in controversy. Carson had hoped for David Letterman to take his place. NBC, however, saw something different in Jay, an everyday charm, a grounded voice for middle America. that quiet battle for the chair would define a new era in television, and it would test everything Jay had built, including his peace of mind. At first, Jay handled the pressure the only way he knew how, by working harder than anyone else. His monologues were sharp, his humor effortless, his timing perfect. Within a year, The Tonight Show with Jay Leno dominated ratings. For millions of Americans, his smile became part of their nightly ritual. Celebrities came to laugh, and audiences came to forget the world's weight for just 1 hour. Behind that effortless laughter, however, lived a man constantly at war with himself. Jay rarely slept more than 4 hours a night. He refused to take vacations, drove himself to exhaustion, and kept his emotions buried under the armor of routine. To him, comedy was both shield and sacrifice. In 2009, after 17 years on top, NBC made an announcement that would ignite one of the biggest storms in television history. Jay Leno would step down, and Conan O'Brien would take over The Tonight Show. To keep both stars, NBC offered Jay his own primetime program, The Jay Leno Show, an experiment that quickly unraveled. Ratings plummeted, local stations protested, viewers were confused. And when Conan's Tonight Show also began to lose its audience, NBC made the controversial move to bring Jay back, pushing Conan to a later slot. Conan refused. The fallout was instant and explosive. Social media erupted with the hashtag #WarfImWithCoco, turning Conan into a symbol of rebellion and Jay into a villain in the court of public opinion. Major newspapers accused him of stealing back the chair. Others defended him as a man trapped by the network's chaos. For the first time in decades, Jay Leno, the man who lived to make people laugh, became the center of anger. Through it all, he stayed silent. No interviews, no defenses. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. The network wanted to stabilize the show, and I took the hit. That line, quiet and measured, revealed everything about his nature. Disciplined, stoic, and deeply private. Even Conan O'Brien, years later, admitted that Jay had handled the situation with more grace than most people knew. When the dust settled, Jay returned to The Tonight Show in 2010, reclaiming his spot at the top of late-night television. But something had changed. His jokes were gentler, his laughter softer. His eyes, though still bright, carried the fatigue of a man who had paid for success with solitude. By 2014, Jay Leno decided to step away on his own terms. No pressure, no scandal, just a quiet farewell. On his final night, he told his audience, "I've had a wonderful run here. Now it's time for the next chapter." The applause that night wasn't just for his career, it was for his grace, his endurance, and the humility that had defined him through every storm. Behind the scenes, Mavis watched proudly, knowing that the man she met on a small comedy stage had become an icon, and yet, somehow, had never stopped being the man who came home with grease on his hands and jokes on his lips. When Jay Leno stepped away from The Tonight Show in 2014, it wasn't a retirement, it was a return to quiet garages, to the smell of motor oil, to the hum of engines and the comfort of solitude. He had spent decades under bright lights, but now his world was lit by the soft glow of headlights and the presence of the woman who had been beside him since the beginning. Mavis continued her advocacy work for women's rights, particularly through the Stop Gender Apartheid in Afghanistan campaign she helped lead from 1997 to 2001. She met with senators, spoke at international forums, and worked tirelessly to bring attention to the oppression of Afghan women. Jay often said, half joking, half proud, "She's the one doing something that really matters. I just make people laugh." It was a sentence that captured their entire marriage, one rooted not in a spotlight, but in substance. He lived without extravagance, saved nearly everything he earned, and never touched his Tonight Show salary, relying instead on his stand-up gigs. Even in fame, simplicity was his compass. And when life began to take that simplicity away, he refused to let it end in despair. By 2025, Mavis's condition had advanced, but Jay had already built a rhythm around her care. One steady, one patient, one full of grace. He no longer counted time in months or years, but in moments. A morning smile, a shared glance, a whisper of her old self returning even for a second. Those who saw them together often said it was as if time itself paused around them. He would hold her hand as they walked slowly to the car, and when her eyes met his, for a fleeting instant, recognition would flicker, a spark from the woman he once knew. And Jay, ever the comedian, would break the silence with a small laugh as if to tell her, "You still got it." He rejected every offer for a documentary about his life. If anyone's going to tell a story, he said, they should tell it about her. Because to Jay, fame was never the point. Love was. Every act of care, every joke cracked through pain, every quiet morning spent by her side was a continuation of the same promise he made in 1980. To love her through every storm, even the ones the world couldn't see. Today, Jay Leno and Mavis Leno live far from the noise of Hollywood. Their world is smaller, quieter, and infinitely more meaningful. There are no scripts, no cameras, just the rhythm of devotion, steady as ever. He once said, "I don't see this as tragedy. It's just part of the promise I made 40 years ago." And that promise, one of care, loyalty, and faith, is now the legacy he leaves behind. Not the cars, not the fame, not even the Tonight Show, but a love story that never needed applause to endure. If you believe true love can outlast time itself, share this story so the world remembers that devotion is not built in grand moments, but in quiet, everyday choices.